Hello, everyone. My name is Sanjyot Mehendale, and as the chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies at UC Berkeley, I want to welcome you all to the second lecture in our fall colloquium series focusing on the role of the Sogdians along the Silk Road. Now, before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to mention some upcoming events. The twice postponed Gandhara conference will be held December 2nd to 4th with a mixed in-person and Zoom webinar format. In addition, Franz Grenet, professor at the Collège de France in Paris, will give 2 in-person talks on Zoroastrianism and the Alexander image in Central Asia, respectively. And these will take place on campus at 5 p.m. on December 6th and 8th. You can find more information about all these events on our website. We realize, of course, that some of you may still be a bit hesitant to attend in-person events. So I'm very happy to report that we'll be recording the workshop and the 2 lectures by Franz Grenet for future viewing. Now, with regard to today's event, as usual, please submit your questions regarding the content of the talk via the Q&A button. For technical assistance, please use the chat function. So now, let me turn to our speaker, Mariachiara Gasparini. She's assistant professor of Chinese art and architectural history at the University of Oregon. She received her Ph.D. in Transcultural Studies, Global Art History from Heidelberg University in Germany for her dissertation, Decoding Central Asian Textile Imagery from the Tarim to the Mediterranean Basin. Her many publications include most recently Transcending Patterns, Silk Road Cultural and Artistic Interactions through Central Asian Textiles, which was published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2019. She's also the co-editor of the upcoming volume 6, on trade and industry of the Bloomsbury Encyclopedia of World Textiles. And that is a work that consists of, it's large, consists of 10 volumes. Now, in 2020, she was one of the recipients of the Henry Luce ACLS Program in Chinese Studies Early Career Fellowships, and she received that fellowship for a project titled Across the Tuyuhun-Tubo Kingdom, Visualizing Material Culture from Dunhuang to Sichuan between the 6th and 9th centuries. This project in particular explores material culture from Qinghai. Finally, she is a contributor to the digital exhibition The Sogdians, Influencers on the Silk Road, and this is a digital exhibition that is organized by the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery in Washington, D.C., and curated by, among others, Dr. Judith Lerner. Professor Gasparini will produce the upcoming piece on Sogdian textiles. Now, it's her expertise on Central Asian textiles, what brought her here today for a talk titled Across the Qinghai-Tibetan Plateau, Sino-Sogdian Textiles Beyond the Main Silk Routes. Welcome, Chiara.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It is always a pleasure for me to talk at the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. I'm going to share my screen. As I said, thank you very much. These are the early results of my forthcoming project. I have been studying Central Asian and Chinese textile for a long time now, and I'm glad to see that lately textiles have become a topic of interest among many peoples and also in academia. Many of the Central Asian textiles that I will discuss today, some of which you can see here on the screen, in the past have been labeled specifically as Sasanian or Sogdian, but also as Zandaniji. But I prefer to call these textiles simply Central Asian. These textiles were created by the combination of different techniques in iconography that were due to the interactions of various groups of peoples along the main Silk Route, but also along some routes that are not so much considered or have not so much considered until now, such as the route from Gansu or Xinjiang across Qinghai to Sichuan and from Qinghai to the Trans-Himalaya. And today I will talk a little bit more about this route. This is the topic of my research, as Sanjyot said, that is sponsored by it was granted by the Henry Luce Foundation. I hope to carry research next year in China. At the moment, I am working with the material held in Western institutions and with the archaeological reports. Before talking about this Qinghai Sichuanese material, I will first provide you with an overview of Central Asian textiles and their development and why these labels, Sogdian or Sasanian, have been created and the misunderstanding around these textiles. Some of the textile iconographies or representation appear in Sogdian paintings, also Sasanian Sogdian object of art, but textiles are not two-dimensional surfaces like a painting, but they are three-dimensional surfaces. And I know and I understand that it's hard to understand why, and I will try to explain. Unlike a painting or any other object of art, textiles have three-dimensional characteristics created by interwoven threads. And so the study of textile implies the study of materials, wool, cotton, silk, linen, also the weight of the yarn, the technique, and the directionality of the weaving in reality or in painting, in a representations. And we have hundreds of different techniques. So today I will talk about some specific ones. The colors that, of course, the textile can be monochromatic, but those from Qinghai, for instance, reach to 8 different types of colors together. The overall composition, which will include different type of elements that can be repeated on a textile ground or also create a sort of specific register or narrative scenes. And of course, the use, which suggests also the rank of a person or why this textile, how these textiles were used. But more interestingly, perhaps, was the diffusion of the Central Asian textile across Eurasian and specifically in some of the area I marked here, as you can see with these stars. So from Europe to Northern Caucasus, Egypt, Central Asian, of course, across the Trans-Himalayas. And today I want to add one more star, that is the one in Qinghai, specifically on the Qinghai-Tibetan Plateau. For more than 60 years in the West, these textiles, which I just mentioned, have become popular because of these rundles motif, or beaded rundles, also called pearl medallion. But we have also other examples that are not, that include just single elements without the rundles, but with this created with the same technique and the same colors. Specifically, these type of textiles with rundles have been known as zandaniji. These names come from a translation of an inscription that was believed to be Sogdian on one of the earliest examples discovered in Europe in the Cathedral of Huy in Belgium. And Walter Henning, that was a German scholar in 1959, translated this inscription as a long 61 span zandaniji. In 2009, this textile was reanalyzed, was radiocarbon dated analyzed, and Nicholas Sim Williams and Jeffrey Kahn to retranslate the inscription that appeared to be a 9th century Arabic inscription that instead referred to the amount of money this piece was sold for. Now, this classification as Zandaniji created a few problems, a few issues in the last 60 years. First of all, Dorothy Shepherd, that was the curator of textiles in the Cleveland Museum, at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and published this first article about Zandanijis with Walter Ennings, divided this textile, all the textile discovered, especially in Europe, into Zandaniji first, Zandaniji 1, Zandaniji 2, and was followed then by Anna Yerusalimskaya, that is the curator of the Northern Caucasus collection at the State Hermitage Museum, that followed this distinction, this categorization, and created third groups. And so we have also Zandaniji 3. The first two groups were based on the different type of techniques. The first was were textiles that were very compact and with a very thick yarn, and with the main warp twisted in the direction. The second group instead saw textiles with warp that were untwisted or slightly twisted in the Z direction. And the third group was based basically on the iconographic models, and specifically on hunting scenes. Now, the term Zandaniji, we found these terms in the text, but it's what they normally refers to textile made out of cotton from the city of Zandana near Bukhara in Sogdiana. And in fact, Zandana was very famous for the production of cotton. So one of the main problems about this textile classified as Zandaniji was the material, because the majority of textiles discovered across Eurasia are made of silk or sometimes of woolen tapestry. But if we look at the famous painting from Afrasiab in Sogdiana, the so-called Hall of the Ambassador, dated to the 7th century, we can spot Chinese people carrying bolts of silk. Of course, we don't know what kind of silk, and also cocoons, possibly, or bolts of raw silk. By the 7th century, in fact, China was already exporting silk yarn made of continuous silk fibers, and I will discuss about it a little bit more later. In the same painting, we also see the so-called Sasanian ambassadors wearing robes apparently made of this type of compounds, which have been, in fact, discovered across Eurasia, and I want to show you some examples. So here on the left, you will see a wool tapestry with the boar head enclosed into beaded rundles. The second one is the reconstruction of a love rundle with the so-called Sasanian duck from Dulan, where we have the royal Tibetan tombs. And the third one is the details of the famous Moshevaya Balka kaftan with rundle enclosing simurg. However, these three are all late production, datable between the 8th and 9th century. And also they do not correspond completely to the pattern that we see depicted. For instance, the duck here is without rundles. So by looking at this material, we should consider that this textile, and they have been considered as Sasanian or Sogdian, but are they really Sasanian or Sogdian textiles? Since Sogdiana was part of the Sasanian empires, and because the Sogdian were merchants, the famous merchants of the Silk Road, that mediated the interaction between the Sasanian and Chinese, they definitely were familiar with this weaving and traded this weaving at least. More importantly, and this is where most of the confusion comes from, this material, this type of robes possibly made of this textile, appear in the rock relief of Takebustan in Iran. And this rock relief is an unfinished work that appeared at the very end of the 7th century. And in this case, we see peoples here, for instance, and I try to match the the textile in the rock relief with some of the Eurasian textiles. We see the simurg, some flowers. We see peoples wearing this kind of robes with a crescent in the beaded rondels. So, of course, the rock relief implied that in reality, these robes were created with this type of weaving in silk, in wool, or also embroidered. But these materials, again, has been discovered specifically in Central Asia and also in Europe, and a few examples in Egypt. We do not have any material evidence from Iran or from China, mainland China. When I say mainland, I mean not the western region of China. We only have visual evidence. One is Takebustan, and then we have another famous painting in the tomb of Xu Xianqiu, dated to the 6th century, where you can see here an attendant with a robe with beaded rondel enclosing a face that has been seen as a bodhisattva. A few small examples are these tiny beaded rondels, normally with the rosette or with peacock or some birds discovered in Chang'an. That was the capital of the Tang and also the Han before. But we have to remember that Chang'an was a very cosmopolitan capital, including many foreign people, also the Sogdian. In Chinese sources, these textiles have been recorded in historical accounts, and they have been referred as non-Chinese textiles, as foreign pattern textiles, sometimes also translated as barbarian textile. And we also found something called Shashana Jin, that is a pattern textile from the north of Bukhara, probably Zandana. But we do not know what type exactly are these textiles, where are these textiles. More specifically, regarding the rondels, in later Islamic sources, we found them recorded as parniyan or parand in 11th century sources that were mostly produced in Eastern Turkestan, and these beaded rondel will refer to coins or to sky with the stars. It is possible, in fact, that rondels, these rondels were developed from non-Chinese coins. They were acquired especially from the 5th and 6th centuries and were used on clothing as embellishment. As we can see from these Byzantine coins discovered in some tombs from Ningxia or Gansu, and they have these holes that will permit, to attach them on the robes. But the motif inside the rondels change over the century. And so while in the first period, we can find this rondel enclosing rosette of leaves, like the piece that you can see here, combined with the so-called Hellenized Central Asian motif. Later, with the arrival of the Turks and the establishment of the first Turkic Khaganate in the 6th centuries, this rondel began to include animals, such as this kaftan here, where you see a repetition of rondel with the stag that appear in many others' private collection. And by the 8th, 9th centuries, the Central Asian textile began to include mirroring animals, normally standing and sometimes on a pedestal or with the central tree. These were somehow similar and possibly developed from early Sasanian time. And again, we do not have any real record from evidence from Iran, but many textiles such as this one with the processional ram, single ram with rondels have been are part of many institution collection and are referred to as Sasanian. So possibly this was, we can assume, the original Sasanian model, but we don't know. Human or human faces were very rare. We only have a few examples from the 8th or 9th centuries, for instance. Some of the motifs, such as duck with the ribbons or simurg of the boar head, became extremely popular. And I'm just want to show you a couple of examples. For instance, this is the a piece probably from the Tibetan tomb that had already appeared in the Kizil caves and appear also in the Illuminati manuscript in Europe. So this motif travel and were reused in many different contexts. Again, the so-called simurg, that is the glory of Iran, and this is how these zoomorphic creatures appear in the early Islamic period. And Matteo Comperetti has done a lot of research on this combination of elements, zoomorphic element. And here again, this is another Central Asian variation where the simurg is standing and possibly was mirrored. And this is an example from the mosaics in the monastery of Sant'Ilario in Venice in the 9th century. And again, the famous boar head that appear in different variations. Probably this was one of the very earliest zoomorphic elements in roundels. And I will talk about this a little bit later. So regarding the material and the structure of this weaving, as I mentioned, the majority of these textiles were made out of silk, sometimes also wool tapestry. In Chinese sources, the word jin is the most popular term that describes a pattern weaving, but it doesn't clarify the structure of the weaving. We know that these terms appear often, and based on the material discoveries, we can identify this type of jin until the 8th century as a work-based weaving. That basically is a technique that will employ two types of work and create the pattern in work direction. And then this technique was substituted by the weft-based takete or samit according to the basic instruction that became extremely popular and are basically the text that I'm talking today. Now, unfortunately, these texts into English are always translated as brocade, but is basically is a mistake, because a brocade is a specific textile that was created in the 12th centuries, and basically is during the Jin dynasty, includes an extra weft which creates a specific pattern in the center of the compound without touching the selvages. So it's a very specific technique. It's more correct probably to say a brocaded weaving more than brocade. So around the 4th or 5th century, we see the development of this weft-based tabby. And again, in Europe, we have great acquisition of Samite, at least until the 10th centuries. The Sasanian, for their part, appeared to have favored the so-called point Berkeley technique, where we see the alternation of weft in different colors, as you can see in these microscopic images. They create a sort of what we call chiaroscuro, or a much more naturalistic effect of the element. And you can see here, for instance, the face also of the horse or the shade on the bodies. This also tells us about different type of workshop in Central Asia. And this Berkeley technique apparently disappeared around the 8th century. So everything that was created after that or around that period was not necessarily created with the Berkeley. The images were much flat. They appear a little bit flat compared to these horses here. So until the 3rd century, China will only allow the export of finished silk or damaged silk floss, but with the arrival of the northern dynasties around the 4th or 5th century, textile began to be woven in the western region in takete with unspun silk yarn made of continuous silk fibers, and substituted the classical Chinese jin that I mentioned before, made basically the work-based compound that did not permit the construction of larger pattern. Therefore, early takete followed the iconographic model of woolen takete and included also Chinese character, as we can see from these two pieces that have been recently published and discussed by Eric Boudot, and one of which you can see here has carry the G character of speciousness. The Northern dynasty between the 4th and 6th century played a fundamental role in Chinese and Central Asian history. Thanks to these people, in fact, China came in contact with the motif technique and what I mentioned is called today Hellenized Central Asian style. In the same period, the Tuyuhun, coming from the northern steppes, descendant of the Xianbei, established themselves in Gansu, Ningxia, and Qinghai provinces, and were eventually absorbed by the Tubo, meaning the Tibetan people, in the 7th century. In Central Asia, instead, we see the arrival of the Huna or the Hun people, also known as the Eftalites. And the origin of whom is still undetermined, but they have been considered Proto-Mongolian people exactly like the Tuyuhun. The Eftalites, who mainly ruled in Tokaristan between 440 and 560 and through the 8th centuries in various Central Asian principalities, had initially moved from the Altai region and included both the Turkic and Iranian speaking tribes. These people apparently were in contact with the Tuyuhun, who were, again, of Proto-Mongolian origin, and apparently mediated interaction and trade between the Chinese and the Eftalites. So it means that they spoke the same language, and they also traded materials such as textiles and metalwork along the southern Silk Road, but also along the Trans-Himalaya and Qinghai-Tibetan Plateau. The interesting thing is that this population, unlike the Iranian and the Chinese, wore very similar clothing, such as the single or double lapel kaftan. In fact, pictorial evidence confirmed the use of this outfit among these people. And here you have some examples from Bamiyan, Balarik Tepe, but also we have example of Tokharian in the Kizil caves wearing such type of outfit. And again, in the Kizil caves, we had traders and merchants that are wearing this type of kaftan, similar to the minty representation of Sogdians and foreign traders wearing a double lapel kaftan and a conical hat discovered in China. But apparently also the Northern dynasty in China, as we can see from these figurines and the pictorial program in the Zhejiang in the Shanxi province used this type of clothing. This pictorial program is particularly important. This tomb was excavated between 2013 and 2014, so it's a kind of recent excavation, and is today considered the largest pictorial program, including hunting scenes in China. But we should consider that Turko-Mongol nomadic leaders of Central Asia behave like patrimonial rulers, trading their realm as households and cultivating three types of clients: close personal retainers, guard corps members, and chief of tribes, necessary to build and maintain power. Political affiliation and subordination were created through kaftan and belt investiture, which these people took very seriously. And to quote Jonathan Scaff, rebels in North China, either coming from elite or humble backgrounds, resemble Central Asian chiefs in building political and military power on a foundation of personalistic patron-client bonds, end of quote. In this regard, these Turko-Mongol people were part of that area of Central Asia, on that area that in the 10th century Central Asian and Persian literature was defined Turan, which was the opposite of Iran, or the Iran Shah, that is the land between the Amur Darya here to the east and the Euphrates River to the west. The eastern boundaries of the Sasanian Empire were already mentioned in a few Sasanian documents, and this division, however, became more evident in the early Islamic period. Also in the Iranian epic poem, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, written by Ferdowsi between 977 and 1010, Turan, which was initially included in the Iranian word system, became the land of non-Iranian people, also called Turks. And according to the Arab geographer Al-Makdisi, in the 10th century, Tubat or Tibet was part of the land of the Turks. There is a great scholarship regarding also the origin of the Tibetan Bond religion, that was the religion before the arrival of Buddhism, and the connection with Zoroastrianism and the connection between the various deities. Recent excavation in Qinghai province, where we have the royal Tibetan tombs in China, have disclosed textile and artwork from these tombs that will confirm also the historical geographical records. Many similar textiles, possibly from this area, have appeared lately on the art market and ended in private collection. Although these textiles dated to the early Tibetan period follow the popular prototype established in Central Asia around the 6th century, which I just discussed, the technical features, color, and other indigenous elements suggest that they were woven in workshop different from those established between Sogdiana and Xinjiang in China. Some of this material was exhibited in a beautiful exhibition organized by the Dunhuang Research Academy and the Pritzker Art Collaborative in Dunhuang between July and October 2019, titled Cultural Exchange Along the Silk Road, Masterpieces of the Tubo Period. I had already had the privilege to analyze and discuss some of the material probably from Qinghai, held in the China National Silk Museum in 2014, which I published and discussed a little bit in my book. And here you can see one of the fragments that I tried to reconstruct as a large panel, and I will discuss this today. And through this material, I had already proposed the connection between Turkic and Tibetan population and their connection across the Trans-Himalaya, or possibly along the southern branch of the Silk Road between Xinjiang, Gansu, and Sichuan. But the material in Dunhuang made this clear and confirmed some of my ideas. In particular, this material confirmed the nomadic cultural connection between the Tuyuhun and the Chinese northern dynasties, and later between the Tibetan and Turkic population, and the acquisition of Zoroastrian element. We have different types of clothing. For instance, we have jacket, boots, cape, and large panel, all showing this large medallion and a large use of stags and ducks. But we also see the set of clothing. This is very famous. So some of these pieces came probably from the same bolt of silk, and they are in different institutions and were part of, they belong probably to a Tibetan prince. But we also see embroideries that have appeared lately on the art market, and most likely came from the same set, but can be dated to an early period, to the Northern Dynasty period or the Tuyuhun. And here, for instance, you have a beautiful saddle in a private collection that is an embroidery. They show roundel enclosing the boarhead and possibly a bird that was possibly the early representation of the famous Simurgh. And this can be compared with a very well-known panel in the Metropolitan Museum. Apparently, this was part of a set of textile and embroideries acquired by a Nepalese family from Tibetan refugees between 1965 and 1975, and sold in London in 2004. We also have a quiver, part of the same set, which was probably created in the same moment. And here you can see the same type of motif, and another piece in Japan. And this piece is particularly important for different reasons. First of all, you can see the mark on the textile that suggests how the textile was folded. And also we have this section that tell us about the original color and the original palette, which reconfirm a large use of red. Lately on the art market, also these ribbon have appeared, probably from the same set, and all this material or this embroidery was created with a chain stitch that is a typical and classical traditional Chinese technique that in the 8th century was substituted by the satin stitch that is basically a straight type of stitch. So this required a lot of time, of course, was a beautiful, refined work of art. Most impressive, however, are this large panel or hanging. And based on my structural analysis and after research textual sources, I argue that these large panels of hanging were used to decorate Tibetan tents, but were also adapted and transformed into clothing. For instance, a cape or cloak featuring arches, including various animals exhibited in Dunhuang and radiocarbon dated to the 7th century, now in the Stiftung in Regensburg in Switzerland, has disclosed a Tibetan ink inscription in the hem, which implies that it was written before the fabric was transformed into this outfit. The custom of inscribing textile or metal work was not unusual. Other pieces, for instance, show inscriptions referring to the ownership, and this is a famous set in the Cleveland Museum of Art that probably comes from Lhasa or other Tibetan temple, and the cup underneath includes a Tibetan inscription translated personal possession of the high-born princess. And there is a lot of scholarship about this inscription. One idea is that the high-born princess referred to the Chinese princess that was sent during the Tang period to Tibet as a bride. But in particular, the cape or the cloak is important because confirmed the use of this textile among Tibetan people, or perhaps Tuyuhun, as we can see from the famous painting Emperor Taizong giving audience to an ambassador of Tibet. The scroll illustrates the Tibetan ambassador wearing a robe made of two types of textiles, a red ground featuring ducks and roundels, like the one that I showed you before discovered in Dulan, and the arches including various types of animals, like the cape exhibited in Dunhuang. By this period, the roundel had become loved, or also were much more complex, and enclosed were created. The central medallion was created with mini beaded roundels, each enclosing an animal, and these love motifs that are very much in line with the Tang lotus flower or peonies that became basically the emblem of the Tang dynasty in China. The combination of all these elements suggests iconographic advancement in web-based compound during the post-Sasanian or early Islamic period. There are various elements that can be related to early Central Asian textiles. Many of these animals were already popular, such as the stag, which began to appear during the Turkic, with the rise of Turkic population. But I want to draw your attention to a very unique motif that is the galloping wild donkey here. And these are pretty new, that appear on this textile, most likely produced in this southwestern region of China. These are other two examples where we have the galloping horses here again, and here this is a lobed medallion. Each lobe includes an animal. Now, we here see also the boars, the full boars, not has boar head, and the lions. And down below here, we have two elephants. Now, neither the lions or the elephants are native of Tibet, but they appear on still in central Tibet, combined together from the 8th century, and also more importantly on Nepalese coins framed by beads. And here you can see the same type of elephant, dated again to the 7th, 8th century. Most likely, these were motifs acquired from India and Iran across the Trans-Himalayan region. The triangular motif here in the body of the stags and also tiny in the body of the elephants are combined with this circular motif that I discussed previously in my scholarship, and altogether suggests a possible cosmogonic meaning. In fact, the circle can be seen as the representation of the sun and the moon. The triangle is a very common motif in many different traditions, but in Tibetan mystical literature is defined as the original truth. The trim at the bottom of these panels, and here you can see the fragment that I analyzed and I discovered to be the continuation of the panel in the Abelstiftung, and also the plain fabric at the top suggests that they were hung and more likely were combined together, or this panel, to decorate a space such as the interior or the exterior of a nomadic tent, as those that we can see also on a Tibetan coffin. These recall very much the Central Asian tents that are still in use today. This specifically is a Kazakh tent, and inside you can see all these panels and rug used to decorate the interior. But as we can see from this coffin, this is the reconstruction of is a detail of a narrative scenes of a mourning scenes on a Tibetan coffin from Guolimo. A large panel with one that was placed on top of the tent. Chinese sources describe luxurious dwelling used by both the Tibetan and Uyghur in the 8th and 9th centuries and refer to these as golden tent. In particular, it is said that the interior was decorated with golden animals cast in the round. But the custom of decorating the interior with silk panel and gold was already used among the Turks in the 6th century. The Byzantine historian Menander Protector described tent belonging to the Western Turks as decorated with silk draperies supported by column with gilded timbers, included a gold seat supported by 4 gold peacock and other gold object at the center. These tents were also called 100-man tents, a term that was used in Chinese sources to describe Xiongnu tent in the past and continued to be used for Mongol tent until the end of the 14th century. 100-man tent suggests the dimension of the space and the implication, of course, of large interior panels. And here you can see some of the gilt and silver plaque that have lately appeared on the art market. These are from some private collection and are considered Tibetan artworks that these plaque possibly were attached on these panels. Without a doubt, textile and gilded cast or repoussé metal work, generally identified as a Central Asian discovery in Qinghai tomb and caves, suggests that they were highly appreciated among the Tibetans. The old Tibetan annals found in Mogao Cave 17 in Dunhuang do not make any mention of burial practices, but refer to the use of turquoise, gold, silver, brass, and copper items and their association with different social ranks. And here you can see another set of gold, of metalwork with, again, the duck, a lion, phoenixes in turquoise. So those discovered in Qinghai were likely traded and imported from Dunhuang or the Kokonor and through the Pamir. However, as already Boris Marshak suggested, some of these objects might have been produced by Tibetan artists. And as recorded also in Chinese sources, Tibetan presented gold and silver objects to the Tang court between the 7th and 9th century, and they, together with textiles. So according to nomadic Turkic tradition, the Kagan, or means the ruler tent, was identified as the Kagan itself. Therefore, on textile, the central mirror royal animal that dominates the scene, in this case the stag, might have been seen, can be seen as the visualization of nomadic universe. And so they might have represented the ruler. In this case, they are mirrored, and they are mirrored for technical reason, the way how the textile was created, in front of a so-called tree of life here that appear also in similar textiles from the same period, probably the same region as well, where we have a sort of Sasanian ruler, or at least Sasanian style ruler. And this type of tree also appear in Takebustan, but this model also appear, for instance, in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. The substitution of human beings with animals seem, in fact, very common on this textile. A comparison can be traced with a contemporary image of a ruler portrayed in Nigar, Afghanistan, dated to the 8th century. The figures that is seated on a throne with two horses wear a crown made with wing and ram horn here, and it's surrounded by animals, including two elephants at the bottom. This figure has been interpreted as the Iranian god Bahman, in the Avesta also the supreme being Ahura Mazda, or the protector of men and animals. But he might be seen as the more straightforward representation of a Turkic ruler portrayed as an Iranian god. Like the Turks, the Tibetan also combined different religion and funerary tradition that eventually shared analogous aspects, such as self-laceration or mutilation, which was a practice that is depicted in the Zoroastrian ritual on one of the marble panel on the funerary couch now in the Mio Museum. And you can see them here behind the Zoroastrian, the priest, dated to the 6th, 7th century, in the mourning scenes in the Dunhuang cave 158, in Kizil cave 224, and again on the Tibetan coffin dated to 8th, 9th century. In the Zhou Shu, the book of Zhou compiled in the 7th century, when someone of the Turk died, the body was laid in the tent while children, grandchildren, and relatives sacrificed sheep and horses in front of it. Then they rode their horses around the tent 7 times and slashed their faces each time they came to the opposite side of the tent entrance. After this first ritual, they chose a day and burned all the deceased belongings, including the tent. Then they dug a grave and buried the ashes. In the 7th century, however, after the fall of the first Turkic Khaganate, the funerary custom of cremation changed to burial practices. And so it's also when we have all these tombs in Julan that are created in a shape of a mound that somehow recall a nomadic tent. The panel of the Tibetan coffin discovered in Qinghai, and this is just one of the 3 coffins, just a small section, exemplify the use of this textile in such contexts, as we can see from the tent that I showed you before, covered with the panel with the roundels, but also by the clothing of these people. And here you can see that they wear kaftan or robe with very large medallion or roundels. Although the origin of these textiles, which likely belong to high-ranking people, is still unknown, technical analysis suggests Sichuan is the possible area where they were woven. Sichuan had been a textile hub since the Han period, and in the 6th century, He Chou, a renowned Sogdian descendant, contributed to the transmission of Western textile technique. It is recorded that he reproduced golden Persian textile for the Chinese emperor. Interestingly, the very first example of golden weaving in China, or today China, is this piece here that was discovered in Dunhuang. From Dunhuang, we have again the Sasanian duck and also the very first example of silk tapestry that probably was based on the famous Kalim, the Iranian today is producing in Turkey, the Kalim tapestry. And here is also where we have this sort of band of stripes with a Pahlavi inscription on the back reading the King of Kings, that is the Sasanian title of the ruler, excavated in Dunhuang. This is particularly important because on the front, you can see this repetition of leaves that appears also on other examples, including the panel here and on a piece in the Cleveland Museum of Art that is categorized as Iranian. Later documents from Dunhuang and Tufan mention the production of larger jin or panels. And we have two examples. We have, they mention a medium jin with this specific measurement, 230 by 110 centimeter. And at that jin or larger jin without any specification, but we assume that must have been bigger than the medium one. So it's possible that these descriptions that are not very specific might have referred to the panels I show you today. And also in this document, we know about the different type of twisting in S direction that generally refer to Chinese textile, and Z twisting referring generally to non-Chinese or Central Asian textiles. It is likely that these were produced on Zulu loom or something similar. We do not have any loom remain of loom that can confirm that the weaving process, but we know that in Iran still today we have this type of loom that can produce up to 10-meter wide panels. So to conclude, from the material discovered, it seems clear that Qinghai was a key region between northern, central, and southern areas, and over the century had developed a unique trade of textiles and metalwork that might have occurred along an exterior route from between Kokonor and Lhasa, and from there to Central Asia. The new composition appeared to have been made explicitly for the Tibetan Empire, which also included at the time a small part of Qinghai and a small part of Sichuan. The weaving process, the preference for red textile ground, and the running wild donkey motif, which appear also on the coffin of Tibetan coffin, are unique features of this compound that suggest they might suggest a local production or a very specific production. Although currently a proper Qinghai weaving production cannot be proved, it is not unfair to say that these textiles were created for the Qinghai inhabitants, perhaps in Sichuan, or imported directly across the Qinghai-Tibetan Plateau from Bactria, today Afghanistan, Pakistan, in the land of the Turanian in Turan, at the border of Iran Shah, where Turk-Iranian models had been assimilated and adapted during the Sasanian period. The Tibetan rose in a transition period between the fall of the first and the establishment of the second Turkic Khaganate, which coincides with the change of nomadic funerary practices and the construction of monumental tombs in the shape of tents, such as those discovered in Qinghai. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Chiara, for this very rich, visually rich also talk. There are a number of questions, but I'd like to just pose one myself before we get to the others. And I'm just wondering, summing up So do you see this rondel motif, you know, originating perhaps in the Iranic environment, in the Sogdian environment / or Sasanian Sogdian environment, and then sort of moving beyond sort of the Iranic world and becoming localized in other places? And here I also really appreciate the attention you pay to the quote non-traditional sort of Silk Road network areas, going beyond that, so that it then becomes localized and locally produced. To follow up on that, then, would be, what would the argument be for the ubiquitous nature of that type of motif across all these various regions that you just presented so well in your lecture?
So yeah, I more I study this textile, and more I can see that definitely the rondel was created based on the evidence we have in Central Asia. And so far we thought about between Sogdiana and Xinjiang, but the evidence that we have are basically from Xinjiang only. I'm right. Talking about the material evidence. So we have, of course, we have pictorial evidence. We know that Iran produced silk, but until we found one single evidence, we don't know anything. Based on what we have, I truly believe that the beaded rondel was created by Turkic population, based on the archaeological evidence, the record around the 6th century. The one enclosing, I'm talking animals, was already around the 5th century, but just with the rosette, just the beads. But those with animals really appear with this nomadic population. And I believe that there is a sort of not like totem, but a sort of talismanic is the connection with their word, with the nomadic tradition, with the hunting scenes, and specifically the stag. The stag is really related to Turkic population. Then we have other animals like the lions, that these are more of the Iranian Byzantine sphere, and I think it was adopted somehow. The elephant is very unusual. But then with what we call the early Islamic period, everything changed. So we definitely have a local tradition. It's possible that also those in Northern Caucasus, in Moshevaya Barka, that have been classified also as a Zandaniji tree. I believe that they were local production because the quality is very low, and also the type of pattern, I didn't show it today, but are just local iconography. Like the galloping wild donkey appear only in these textiles from Qinghai, Sichuan. We do not prove, as I say, yet, but I strongly believe that, yes, probably there was a pre-Iranian tradition like the ram. We know that looking at the Iranian metalwork, the ram, the boars are part of the Iranian, the winged horse discovered also in Egypt, but then this changed. We see a much larger range of animals that arrive with the Turkic that did not exist before. And I think that is really local. One thing that I'm still researching is Afghanistan. What is Afghanistan today? Right. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult area, but we have the Ashaba collection from the caves in Afghanistan, where we have a lot of material. Normally, these are dated to the late medieval period, but also to the Han period. So I think that there was a specific, I cannot prove it yet, but I think that there was a very specific production in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Where a specific workshop that produced their local iconography. As I say, based on the evidence, we have to go with the archaeological evidence. And I talk always about Sogdiana Xinjiang, but I think that there is a Bactrian Afghan specific production that crossed the Trans-Himalayas.
Great, thank you. Adam has a question. Should the name Sandanji now no longer be used at all?
This is an endless battle that all the textile historians like me that work on this material, yes, we do not use it. But it's part of scholarship. It's become a tradition. But yes, it's not technically correct. We do not have any evidence. We just know that Zandaniji was a cotton, based on the record, was a cotton textiles. And this iconography does not appear on cotton, only in silk and wool.
I had another question, and it was not part of your lecture, but I've always wondered about it. The Astana textiles, how do they sort of fit, right, in terms of where you think they were produced, how they fit in iconographically with some of the other material that you've been studying?
I think you brought a little bit. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. Where the Astana Turfan textiles fit. I mean, it's not sort of, it wasn't part of your talk today and your topic today, but I've always wondered, because that is a sort of archaeologically significant collection.
They're dated between the, let's say, 6th, 7th century, and these are those that I call Sino-Sogdian production. They were local production. We have many evidence that they were this workshop in Turfan. So one of the idea is that actually the Rambla developed in Turfan. So yeah, that was a local production, a Turfanese production.
Well, great. Yeah. I see no more questions. So that leaves me to just thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your recent research. And we look forward, I look forward to reading about it in the upcoming years. I'm sure the publications are going to
hopefully China will open the doors,
and that you're able to travel and continue your work in situ, if you will. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And
thank you very much for having me. Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.